Hi, welcome back to the channel. This is part two of the mixing board pedal combination explanation video series that I'm doing. In part one, we talked about time-based effects, things like delay and reverb that leave trails through time. In part two, I'm going to talk about wave-based effects, things that are contained to the present moment in feedback and don't leave behind these trails in their process. This includes things like distortion and fuzz, phasers, other effects like ring modulation, dynamics processors, filters, all of these things where you have a simple input, process, output function. Before we get to those sound demonstrations, though, I'm going to start the video with a few thoughts on how I explore a pedal in feedback with the mixing board. And then I'm going to finish the video with some thoughts on performance. Something that you may notice about my videos and my approach to integrating pedals with the mixing board in feedback is that I don't use a lot of pedals. The most simple explanation for this is that I don't have a lot of pedals. There are a couple that I've picked up over time because they're curious, beautiful, interesting objects that I want to incorporate into my musical practice. But I don't come from a background with guitars or working with pedals, and my collection is going to be quite limited and also fairly peculiar. As such, I can't really demonstrate a wide variety of pedals in feedback. I think the thing I can do is provide a process for how you might go about exploring any pedal that you have in feedback with the mixing board. And so I have a process here that I would like to suggest for exploring that connection with a new pedal. The first thing that I really want to know with a pedal is, what does it sound like on its own? I want to get a sense for the specific transformative process that the pedal does between its input and its output. And so I will experiment with the pedal all by itself. What does a standard instrument level sound coming into the pedal sound like? What does it sound like on a guitar? What does it do to a guitar signal? And then what does it do to the mixing board as an instrument? What does the pedal sound like processing the mixing board? Because given the levels of the signal and the types of waveforms that the mixing board is producing compared to other things that traditionally go into a pedal, you might find that the way that it handles the mixing board is actually quite different than a lower level source. But either way, starting with that question of what happens in between the input and the output, simply without any additional feedback, is the first question to answer about a pedal. The next thing that I like to ask is, how does the pedal sound on its own in feedback? What does a simple feedback loop sound like for the pedal? If I have the output of the pedal at unity with no EQ adjustments, and I run the output of the pedal back into the input, what types of sounds do I get out of it? Once I have a sense of what the pedal does and what the pedal does to itself in feedback, then I like to try introducing different kinds of instability to reach new feedback states. What does blending in another tone sound like? What do pulses sound like? What does low frequency or high frequency content sound like? In searching for instabilities to introduce into the loop to push it into new states, you start to map out a wider possibility space of the pedal with the mixing board in feedback. From there, the next thing that I like to ask is, what are the ways of interacting with the pedal? What are the gestures that are available to it? Are there knobs that are good to sweep in conjunction with each other? What sort of discrete dynamic effects happen when you flip switches? And how can these be performative gestures? This gets towards understanding the pedal as part of an expanded interface with the mixing board. Once I've started to explore these questions here, something that I find really, really useful with any piece of equipment is to read the manual, especially once you've started developing intuitions about the piece of equipment, then going back to the manual and having the official explanation for how everything works can let you find things that you may have overlooked, and also to understand the manual in the context of trying to accomplish the type of sound that you want to be making. Throughout this whole process, I like to take notes if I'm doing this very seriously. The first pedal that I'm going to be exploring is the Walrus Audio Jupiter Fuzz. Just to note, this is the same patch that I was using before in part 1. I have a isolated feedback loop here. I have a parallel feedback loop from the aux1 send, and I have the return for the pedal. The pedal is coming out of the control room submix, and things are being routed to it using the solo buttons. Now, in my experience with fuzz and distortion type pedals, they do something very different for the mixing board than they do for other sources. I love a good fuzz for the way that it crushes a sound, but the mixing board is already so high gain. I haven't found fuzz does a lot to the sustained signal of the mixing board. And the fuzz pedal in feedback by itself also doesn't do a lot. You're bringing it up to a level where it clips and it sounds sort of like a mixing board channel. Let me show you. Now, this is not to say that the fuzz does not have its own uses in the mixing board. And there are actually a few ways that I have found of using this thing that I really like. You can think of all of the amplification that we get in a fuzz as almost like a magnifying glass on the small interactions of the mixing board. First off, when we really amplify it, with the channel bleed, it can even start to feed back into itself, even though we're not sending anything into it. And we can pull out these really beautiful fragile sounds. But now if we also start to bring in some sound from the aux sends here, I find those sounds to be just so beautiful and delicate. The other place that I really like this fuzz pedal is with a noise channel. It really has something to grab onto in the noise. Let me set this up real quick. Here's a noise channel. I've just pulled out the cable here to create noise at a certain preamp condition, and I can shape that noise. I can shape that noise with the EQ, but I can also send this noise into the fuzz and listen to what this sounds like. I'm going to turn off the bass cut. I'm in mode 2 here. Here's our noise. Listen to the way that that just like starts to almost sputter a little bit. I love that sound. Now I've muted this channel so that we only hear it routing through the fuzz. And the tone control on the fuzz is so good for the noise. And now if we route that into an aux channel here, this opens up a bunch of new crunchy noise textures with some really nice tone shaping. Makes it something beautiful with the mixing board. Continuing with this idea of pedals that work through amplification, I have the Voyager preamp / overdrive here. I almost thought about just skipping this pedal. You might think that it's just less gain than something like the Jupiter Fuzz, but there's actually some really cool behavior on this pedal, and I'm glad I tried it out, and I'd love to demonstrate it for you here. Just in a simple feedback loop with itself, sort of sounds like a mixing board channel. But when we start to feed that into a feedback loop, let me set up my feedback here for the aux one. Can give us a variety of sounds. The gain works sort of like a compression on that. And so we can adjust, we can increase the gain and bring down the volume and sort of compress our signal in a nice way. And with the tone adjustment, this actually shapes a core feedback loop in some really interesting ways. The pedal works as this additional tonal control on the feedback loop. I think that it gets into some really beautiful, subtle character variation. And to think about the controls on the Voyager here as an expanded part of this channel interface, the way that this augments the tone here is really, really beautiful to my ear. I think that even a simple pedal can surprise you in what it does in feedback, and exploring what any pedal does can take you to someplace new and exciting if you're patient with it. The last pedal that I want to demonstrate here is a phaser. This is the Marigold from Lantern Manufacturing. And a phaser creates a really beautiful sweep in a sound with all of these little notch filters, depending on the stages and the amount of regeneration on that path. As such, this sort of works as a modulation / filtering pedal in the way that we're going to think about it here. For starters, we're just going to listen to what it sounds like on its own. This one has this steps mode, which takes the modulation signal and turns it into a stair-step signal. Let's bring in some additional feedback here. A pedal with modulation built into it will immediately begin to create structure for the feedback loop, where modulating something, we're able to control the controls of our feedback loop in a new way. Isn't this a beautiful and unexpected ecosystem of sound that we've discovered here? With a pedal like a phaser, there's also the great opportunity just to ping that pedal. So I'm going to take this pulse that I have here, and I'm going to run that into the pedal without any additional feedback except for the regen that's on the pedal here. And so there are all sorts of creative ways to bring these things together. And that's just about all of my pedals. But there are a few other effects, things that I don't have, that I want to point out as particular things to consider with the mixing board. The first is more dynamics processors, things like compressors, but also things like tremolo, which are going to introduce that modulation with amplitude modulation to the signal. These can both tame feedback in a way that lets you shape your feedback loops, but then also create instability with something like a tremolo. Filter and EQ type pedals, things that let you shape the frequency of your signal, are fantastic. I love the EQ on the mixing board. The more filters and frequency shapers that you have in a hybrid feedback system, the better, in my opinion. Additional modulation effects like a chorus will introduce movement into your feedback loop, and that movement can destabilize and kick things off into a new direction. A very common element in feedback patching for more modular synthesis styles of feedback patching is ring modulation. You see ring modulation get used in a feedback loop all the time, particularly with a reverb, in order to prevent the buildup of particular resonant frequencies by ring modulating the reverb signal and the original signal together. I don't know my ring modulation guitar pedals that well. I don't think a lot of them let you introduce two separate signals together, but if there are ones that do, that type of ring modulation of two parts of your feedback path together can be really helpful for controlling and shaping feedback in interesting directions as well. It's all there to explore. One of the things that is exciting to me about this space is that I have no idea what the majority of pedals will do in feedback, because it might not be the same as what they do to a more traditional input signal. I think that there's a lot there to explore. To simply reiterate something that I said in the first part of this video, the most important thing is that you're getting the sounds that you want to be making out of your instrument. And so as you're thinking about what pedals to bring together, use as many or as few effects as you like. The opportunities for routing them together are the same as they are when you're working with just the mixing board. You're thinking about parallel feedback, feedback in series. How are you duplicating the signal to route it to multiple places on the machine? Thinking in terms of routing, I think, is one of the things that makes the mixing board so beautiful as a hub for feedback. The most important thing, though, is that you just find a sound and a way of interacting with your instrument and a logistical setup that works for you. I said before that part of the reason that I don't use pedals so often is that I don't have a lot of pedals, but it's also because I work mostly on this spot on my desk here where I'm also doing recording. It's right next to my computer, and I'm picking things up and putting things down. A setup with lots of cables and lots of objects just doesn't work for me personally in the way that I use my instrument. The logistical side of things, what is easy for you to work with, is just as much of a consideration, I think, as what you have and what you want to put together to make technical sound. The last thing that I want to talk about before wrapping out this video is the idea of performance and interface. Thinking about pedals and the mixing board together as a hybrid instrument, I would encourage you to think about it not only as a way of expanding the technical possibilities of your instrument and the feedback loops that you're working with, but also thinking about every pedal that you add as an additional part of your performance interface. You're introducing a set of knobs and switches to control your instrument. Every pedal is going to introduce new performative affordances to your system. With the delay pedal from the first video, I love sweeping the time knob and thinking about that as a main part of my control interface for making sound with the pedal and the mixing board together in feedback. This idea of performance and designing a interface that lets you do the interactions that you want to do with your instrument, I think is really important, because the sounds that you make are less important than how you work those sounds. I'm loosely paraphrasing Toshimaru Nakamura here when I say that when you create sound, you have a responsibility for it when you introduce sound into the world. And then how you shape or guide that sound is more important than the specific sound that you've made. In this way, I think that small things like amplitude and being able to make subtle adjustments within the frequency content of a feedback loop let you move a sound around and take care of it to guide it into a musical performance. The interface that you construct gives you a vocabulary for manipulating sound, and listeners will latch on to that vocabulary that you present in order to understand how you're working with the sounds that you're creating. As I said before, I'm describing my approach to integrating pedals with the mixing board. I like this small, focused approach because it fits on my table and it fits in my brain. But in putting these videos together, I hope that I've demonstrated some techniques and ways of approaching this question that can help you find your own approach, whatever that may be. As I said in the first video, if you're making the sound that you want to be making, then you're not doing it wrong. I hope what I've demonstrated here encourages you to take what you have and to make music with it. And as you do that, I hope that you will be generous with what you find in your explorations. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you have a great day.